Thank you so much for that nice introduction. Can everyone hear me? Okay, just wave at me if the microphone stops working. I have been away from the Explorers Club for several years. I've been living in Los Angeles, so this is my first time back in about 3 years, and it feels really good to be back in my favorite building in New York. And what I've been doing in Los Angeles is, in part, some of the research that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And this all started years ago when I was living in Rome, and I was crawling through a catacomb underneath the city as part of a certification course in urban speleology, which is basically urban spelunking. And while I was under there, with the remains of several thousand ancient Romans, I started thinking about their lives and their deaths. And obviously, their ancient culture was very different from our own. But what was intriguing to me, and what is still intriguing to me, is what we have in common. And the things that concern us, the things that we care about, situations that are an inherent part of any human life, they're the same today as they were 2,000 years ago. And one of the most interesting to me, one of the most universal challenges that humans face is the concern with health. And challenges of disease and injury are things that all people of all periods have had to confront. Now, waging war and the resulting injuries from this also seems to be a part of the human condition, and Romans were no exception. So that experience triggered my interest in the topics that are currently the focus of my research, which is ancient Roman medicine and medical technology, and more broadly, the ways in which Romans reacted to medical crises such as epidemics, not just at the level of medical response, but at the level of societal response. And so how were these epidemics impacting, shaping, and changing the fabric of the Roman Empire? So these are the things that I've been interested in and been delving into. So tonight, for the purpose of this lecture, I'm going to be focusing on two primary things. One is a recently excavated archaeological site that's told us a great deal about Roman medical technology. And the second is a specific event, a specific epidemic that occurred during what we call the Golden Age of Imperial Rome. And this is the Antonine Plague that swept through the empire beginning at only 3 years into the reign of Marcus Aurelius. So it began in around 164 AD. And I believe that this particular event, this particular epidemic, contributed significantly to what we call the 3rd century crisis. This is a century where we see a great deal of destabilization in the Roman Empire and what we would call its decline. This is when it starts. But first, let me set all of this in a little bit of context in terms of Roman medical culture and cult. What exactly did the Romans think of medicine, and what was its place in their culture? So, as you know, Romans were a polytheistic society. They had many gods and goddesses, most of whom were adapted from the Greek pantheon of deities and given different names. Now, Apollo was Apollo in both the Greek and Roman religions, and in addition to being the god of the sun, he is also strongly associated with medicine and healing and the plague. He was thought to be able to inflict the plague when he was displeased, as well as be able to cure it when he was disposed to do so. So it's hardly surprising, then, that according to Greek mythology, Apollo was the father of the deity of medicine. So the son of Apollo, one of his many sons, is Asclepius, and Asclepius is the god of medicine. The shrines and sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius in the Greek and Roman world were the first hospitals in these cultures. So these were essentially the first hospitals of the Greco-Roman world. They were called Asclepia in the plural, and the three most important ones were all located in Greece, ancient Greece, which today is modern Pergamon in Asia Minor and western Turkey, Epidavros on the mainland of Greece, and Kos, which is a Greek island. That's where Hippocrates trained 2,500 years ago. Now, the Romans deliberately imported Asclepius. Many of the gods and goddesses just sort of evolved and became part of the Roman pantheon, but Asclepius was different. They went out and got him because in 293 BC, there was another epidemic. We think it was a typhoid fever outbreak, and they felt they needed a deity that could deal with this. So they brought Asclepius directly from Greece, built him a temple on Tiber Island in the middle of the river that flows through the city of Rome, and that is the first temple to Asclepius that we have in the Latin West. So from the very beginning, medicine in the Roman world had very strong Greek associations, and these associations were still very much present centuries later in the time periods that we're going to be looking at tonight. So most physicians who practiced in the Latin West were either Greek or had trained in Greece at one of the Asclepia, or had been tutored by other Greek doctors, or all of the above. Now, this is the case with a doctor that has come to our attention quite recently, thanks to the excavations of a rather fabulous site in a town called, my laser pointer, there we go, town called Rimini on the northeastern coast. The site is called the Domus del Chirurgo, which is House of the Surgeon, and it was discovered in 1989, and as often happens in Italy, these things are generally discovered during construction of something modern, and it was discovered during a resurfacing of the Piazza Ferrari, and the excavations took place over the next 20 years. It was a very well-done excavation, took a long time, and until now, the only site like it that we know of, also called the House of the Surgeon, was from Pompeii, and that dates from 79 AD, which is the year that Vesuvius erupted. This site dates to the mid-3rd century, when Rimini was sacked by invading Germanic tribes in around 260 AD. So ironically, the method of this house's destruction is what accounts for its preservation almost 1,800 years later. Fire destroyed the wooden supports of the upper story, which collapsed and preserved the mosaics and the artifacts on the lower story. And that's the story that we're very excited about, because this is where the physician worked. The family lived on the upper floor. The area was almost completely abandoned until the 5th century. This is when the Roman Emperor Honorius moves the capital up to Ravenna and the area becomes revitalized. But it had been essentially abandoned for 150 years. And this is a good thing, because by then the structures underneath had been forgotten. They built on top of them, and thus they remained preserved and underground until 1989. So this is a plan of... I'm going to blow up anyway. This is a plan of the House of the Surgeon, and it's an unusual shape. Romans were pretty methodical about how they built their domus structures, houses, but this one was built into Republican-era buildings, so 1st century BC. It had to respect the street. You have an ancient road running along here, so that's why you have this sort of asymmetrical shape to the house, and there were some interesting modifications that the excavation team noticed. This here is an internal corridor. Okay, so think of it as like a hallway. This is the exterior garden. What they noticed is that windows had been deliberately built into a pre-existing wall to let in light into the corridor. And then in this room, which we call a cubiculum, bedroom basically, also had windows modified, built into a pre-existing wall. The ancient Greek and Roman doctors adhered very closely to the Hippocratic texts, and Hippocrates wrote what we call prescriptive literature. It's basically a how-to. This is the ideal environment for a patient. This is the ideal environment for surgery. And one of the things that he was very insistent on is that there be as much natural light as possible and free movement of air. So these windows, we believe, were created to facilitate this. And so the patient's bedroom, now if you were wealthy and you could pay your doctor to do this, you would move into his house for the duration of your treatment, and you would have your own bedroom. And it would be annexed to what we call the medica taberna, that is the clinic. That's the doctor's office. This is the hypocaust. That's an underground structure. It's missing the floor. It's the radiant heating apparatus of the home. So this is how they heated their houses. And we think that this was some sort of reception room. That's still very much a question mark. In the medica taberna, in the office of the doctor, we have this Orpheus Mosaic. Now, Orpheus is also associated with physicians and medicine. Since he went into the underworld, he challenged death to bring back his lover. She had been bitten by a snake and died. It's the only mosaic in the house that depicts an anthropomorphic figure, picture of a human figure here in the middle. And as you can see, it's very finely done. This is a polychrome mosaic. It's a very expensive mosaic. In fact, the whole house is very luxurious, and the furnishings are quite fine. So this was a good doctor. He was successful. He clearly had a lot of patients that were willing to pay for his services. So we can tell a fair amount about his socioeconomic status by looking at the remains of this site, by investigating this site. So this would have been the first thing that patients would see when they come into the doctor's office. So that would be a very comforting thing, to be reminded of the story of Orpheus and what Orpheus was capable of. Now, the museum in Rimini, the Archaeological Museum, they did kind of a neat thing. They recreated two of the rooms as accurately as possible based on the excavation. This is the patient's cubiculum. We know a fair amount about this doctor, including his name. And the reason we know that is because one of his patients told us. His name was Eutyches. And excavators found right here by the head, where the head of the patient would have been, a graffito, an inscription that had been carved basically into the wall, this red fresco that runs around the border of the room, and it says, Eutyches is a good man. So the script, the style of epigraphy, the style of writing was analyzed, and it's consistent with the mid-3rd century in this time, in this region. And so we can be fairly certain that he's talking about the doctor, and he was so grateful to this doctor that he decided to vandalize the wall. Now, the labels on the medicine bottles that were found also in this site were labeled in Greek. The name Eutyches is Greek. This is consistent with what we know of the medical tradition of Rome, that most practicing physicians were either Greek or trained in Greece. And this certainly seems to be the case with Eutyches. This is the museum's rather splendid recreation of the Medica Taberna. That is the part of the Orpheus Mosaic. You can get a sense of the furniture in here. We have the charred remains of this furniture. This is recreated quite accurately. You can see if you look carefully. Here, I'll make it a little easier. This is the desk, some of the instruments, medical instruments. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you look carefully, you'll see a clay foot. This is not an idiosyncratic decoration. This is actually a therapeutic vessel. Here it is close up. We're missing the back of it, but the top would be open, and the patient would put his or her aching or injured foot into the vessel. Hot medicated, or warm rather, medicated oil would be poured into the top, and it was your original Epsom salt foot bath. So it was a curative treatment. The Medica Taberna, where this was found, is the area of the house where we found most of the artifacts related to the physician's practice. So medicine bottles, bowls and spoons used to mix and measure medications, larger bowls used for bloodletting or to collect blood during surgeries. But the truly extraordinary find of this site in this room was a cache of over 150 medical instruments. This almost doubles the number of medical surgical instruments that we have from this time period from the Roman world, and it's the largest cache of surgical instruments found from the Roman period of any century anywhere in the empire. So it was extraordinary. The majority of these were in the Medica Taberna, in the clinic, in the office. And you can see from looking at these that the heat of the fire had melted the metal, and some of these instruments are now stuck together, and they can't really be separated without damaging them. This collection of instruments tells us even more about Eutyches, about this doctor and his area of expertise. First of all, it reinforces the idea that he's quite wealthy. 150 instruments is an extraordinary number. These are expensive. They are made of bronze and iron. They are not easy to make, so they have to be made by very fine artisans. Eutyches clearly specialized in bone trauma and wound treatment. Now, it's very likely that he did a great deal of his training with the military. So most of his experience, or at least a great deal of it, would have been working in what are called the valetudinaria. These are military field hospitals. Human dissection for medical training was illegal in Rome by the 2nd century BC. So Roman surgeons learned on the job, and they learned their craft, their expertise in these military field hospitals. Now, backing up this conclusion is that in one of the other areas of the site excavators found a very substantial collection of weapons, and this is an unusual type of find in a medica taberna, in a place where medicine was being practiced. So we are pretty confident that this man had very strong connections to the military. So what I have done is, because a lot of our instruments from this cache are melted together, I have taken this image. This is from a collection in Jerusalem, but I chose it because it's much easier to see these pieces, and every one of these that you see here from the Jerusalem collection is represented in the Rimini collection. So Eutyches had all of these instruments. Now, what you see in the lower right and top center, these are instruments, different shaped spoons, used to debride wounds, so to clean out necrotic tissue, foreign objects, dirt, clothing, whatever has embedded itself in the wound and is preventing the wound from healing properly. In the middle of it, you see this forked probe. Probes were a part of treating the traumatic injuries, especially from weapons. In the center, these are bronze scalpel handles. The iron blades have rusted and disintegrated, but the bronze resists that better. The lower left, we have spatula probes, again, for working in wounds. Upper left are a set of forceps. And left of the center, this little group, these are hooks that the surgeon's assistant would use to hold the skin back from the edge of the wound so that the surgeon could access the wound more easily. In addition, we have needles, catheters, bone drills, bone chisels. On the lower right, you see a bone axe for amputations, and we had arterial clamps so that the patient wouldn't bleed out during an amputation. These scary-looking things on the upper left, these are called extraction forceps. They were used for removing teeth and pieces of weaponry embedded in bone. They look and served as heavy-duty pliers. Now, on the lower right, these are what are called cupping vessels, and this is kind of an interesting technique. It's still practiced in some Eastern medicine today. They're made of bronze. The metal was heated, and the opening of these cups was placed over the infected wound. As the bronze cooled, it created a vacuum inside, and this would draw the infected fluids out of the wound. So it was one of the ways in which they tried to prevent and address infection in a wound. Now, the object that had everyone the most excited was this one. In terms of ancient Roman medical instruments, and the five of us who really enjoy studying this stuff, this was the mythical unicorn. This is the one that we'd all read about, but nobody had ever found one. And in fact, some scholars were questioning whether or not it even existed, if it was just sort of a theoretical instrument. It is called a Diocles Spoon. This is a replica. Actually, it is a fake. It's in a museum in Germany, and it was proven a couple decades ago to be fake. But I've included it here because it's much easier to visualize what this instrument is and how it works. Arrows do almost as much, if not more, damage coming out as they do going in. The barbed ones, especially, which is what the majority of arrows were at this time. So the Diocles spoon was a device devised specifically to extract arrows or arrowheads from wounds. So here is the one, or the half of one, that was found in the Rimini site. So the way this works is someone gets an arrow stuck in them, embedded in their arm, or their leg, or their chest. The shaft of the arrow is cut down to the level of the body, down to the skin. And what this scissor-like apparatus with the two spoon sides, these two sides are slid down the arrow shaft. So they're creating these smooth surfaces as it goes in. And you see the hole here at the bottom. That hole is meant to hook the end of the arrow. So the end of the arrow goes into the hole. These two smooth spoon protectors basically are clamped over the entire arrow. So now you have a very smooth piece that can be gently extracted without tearing the flesh the way that the barbed arrow would have coming out. So this was sort of an ingenious invention. We knew from the writings that doctors, the surgeons, were using something like this. We'd never found one until this excavation. So that was very exciting. So this is a very brief overview of some of the surgical technology that physicians had at their disposal in the Imperial Roman period. But what about medicine? What about the pharmaceuticals? What did they have in their arsenal for infection and illness? Because no matter how good of a surgeon you are, infection and shock is a very real and dangerous and fatal part of surgery. So we have a lot of texts from the Roman period that talk about various medicinal substances, herbs and minerals and other types of substances. And some of them are rather amusing and harmless and possibly harmful, but others were quite effective and form the basis of some of the pharmaceuticals that we have today. So we'll take a look at some of these. Dysentery was a condition that ancient people were very concerned with because this had a tendency to incapacitate armies. The Romans were a martial society. They were very reliant on the rigor and health of their armies. There is a particular clay from the Greek island of Lemnos that was used throughout the Mediterranean world at this time to treat dysentery. Now, this clay contains elements that are very similar to kaolin and bentonite. These are used in modern medicines for the same condition. Wild ginger was prescribed for nausea. Drinking iron dissolved in wine was recommended by Hippocrates for treating anemia. There is a plant called ephedra right here. Pliny the Elder describes ephedra as a substance used to treat hemorrhaging, allergic cough, and asthma. Our modern drug ephedrine, derived from the same plant, is used for similar conditions today. Myrrh, as in frankincense and myrrh. These substances get a rather prominent honorable mention in the Nativity story in the New Testament. These two tree resins are not valued because they smell nice. They were extremely valuable, prized, sought-after medications in the ancient world. They were believed to help with infection, and in fact, when tested in our modern times, they found that myrrh and frankincense act as bacteriostatics. They essentially arrest the replication of bacteria, and this can have a significant effect on the prevention of infection. And this is why it appears in the Nativity story. This is why they are such precious substances. They are very prized medications. Aloe vera is recommended for skin conditions and burns. And my favorite is this one. This is cinnamon tree. Cinnamic acid, which is in the cinnamon bark, the cinnamon that we use to flavor our food, has antibacterial, antifungal, and parasite-fighting properties. Now, oil of cinnamon has been demonstrated to be quite a powerful germicide, and the molecular structure of cinnamic acid is almost identical to phenol. That's one of the pioneering antiseptics of the 19th century. So there is no evidence that Romans used, or Greeks or Romans used cinnamon to flavor food. It was a very useful medication for them. Now, one of the more unlikely substances used by ancient Greeks and Romans in abundance was a substance called castiorheium, which was obtained against all odds from the male glands of this fellow here, the male beaver. So however bizarre, this may be the only animal product to contain salicin and salicylic acid. This is aspirin. Also in willow bark, which Hippocrates also recommends for fever reduction. Now, the castioreum, obtained from the beaver, contains something known as hydrocinamic acid, very, very similar to cinnamic acid, which we know is very similar to phenol. So the Romans did have some medications that were effective treatments for some of these conditions. Now, shock. Shock is a problem, especially when you're dealing with surgical patients. As far as anesthetics, opium was the most common and the most potent. We know it was used in many of the ancient civilizations of the region: Assyria, Egypt, Rome, Greece, Mesopotamia. It was very prized as an anesthetic. Now, the problem is, in none of this literature do we have any indication that they understood dosing. So you do have these ancient case studies in which, the patient is sort of put out during the surgery is successful, there is no shock, the patient doesn't wake up anyway. They are overdosed, they've been overdosed, and they die of opium overdose. So dosing was a problem. So that is a very sort of broad overview of some of the medical technology that we are looking at in the Roman period, what they have. And what I'd like to do is shift gears a little bit, pan out more broadly, and going from some of the viable means the Romans had of dealing with injuries and illnesses, and now looking at the epidemics, because then as now, modern science, ancient science, bumps up against medical crises that they are technologically unprepared to deal with. Now, throughout history, not just the Roman world, epidemics have had a significant impact on ancient and modern cultures, and they seem to be on a lot of people's minds these days, in this time. So I wanted to kind of pan out the camera and take a look at an epidemic that's currently the focus of my research. And it happened about a century before the date of the House of the Surgeon. And I believe that this epidemic was part of the reason we see a general destabilization of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. And this is when the Rimini site was destroyed. This is why the Rimini site was destroyed. They could no longer hold the frontiers of the empire in that region. So this is the Antonine Plague. It was a devastating epidemic that swept through the empire beginning in about 164, 165. Now, let me set the historical stage for this time, because this is a very dynamic period in Roman history. We're right in the middle of what we call the High Imperial period, or the Golden Age of Imperial Rome. Marcus Aurelius and his co-emperor, Lucius Verus, are the last in a string of extremely competent ruling administrations that have greatly expanded the empire's borders and ushered in an unprecedented period of economic prosperity and general political stability at this time. Now, it's not without its conflicts and issues, of course, but the empire right now is at the height of its strength. Well, here's a map of the empire at the end of Trajan's reign in 117. By the mid-160s, these borders still hold. This is a very healthy empire right at this time. And you can see this is a cohesion that this region had never seen before or since. Now, at this time, in the mid-160s, the Roman armies are fighting against Parthia in the east, over here, and against Germanic tribes in the north. Okay, so they're dealing with wars on two fronts at the moment. Lucius Verus is leading the legions in the east, and when that campaign, which was successful, was concluded, he came back with his remaining legions, but they brought something else with them besides war booty, and they brought plague, which Eastern texts from Mesopotamia and China, Mesopotamian region and China, tell us had already been circulating as far east as Eastern China in the early 2nd century. So this is something that's basically moving its way across this part of the world. The soldiers picked it up in Parthia, and then as they returned to Rome, the legions were redistributed to other frontiers, and so this disease spread rapidly. One of our best sources for this comes from the writings of Galen. This is a physician in the 2nd century. He had trained at the Pergamon Asclepion and was in Rome in 166 in the middle of the outbreak. So he had a sort of a bird's eye view. He had firsthand knowledge of this disease. We have a lot of Galen's case studies. They remain to us. I've got 5 volumes of them sitting on my bookshelf at home. And they're his notes from cases of patients that he treated. So we do have case studies of Galen's observations of this disease. The pathology of this plague has been a matter of debate for over a century, but modern science has helped us identify this particular illness with relative certainty based on contemporary descriptions of the symptoms as well as what we know about the evolution of certain diseases. So until recently, it was thought that this epidemic could have been either the smallpox or the measles, with most experts coming down on the side of smallpox. And you'll probably agree with me when you see the next few sets of slides. This was made even more certain by a study that was published in 2010 by a team of epidemiologists that concluded that measles as a molecule did not evolve until the beginnings of the 6th century. Bubonic and pneumonic plague is something that we don't see in this part of the world also until the 6th century. So we're almost positive that the epidemic we're dealing with in the 2nd century Rome is the smallpox. This is almost certainly the first time this disease has been seen in the Greco-Roman world. We know from forensic pathology that the Egyptians had a bout with it several hundred years before, 1,000 years before. But this is the first time the Greeks and Romans have had to deal with it. Now, they had plagues before. There was a famous plague in Athens in the 5th century. That was probably typhus or typhoid fever. So the problem with many problems with the smallpox, but for the Greeks and Romans in particular, they'd never been exposed to it before. So there was no conferred immunity. This is a virgin population in terms of this virus. So it also, that including, in combination with the army's mobility, this disease spreads quite rapidly. Now, complicating the process of identifying the disease is the fact that we now think there's actually 2 strains of the smallpox that the Romans were contending with. There's several strains of the virus, but the 2 we think that the Romans were dealing with, based on the descriptions, was one called hemorrhagic smallpox. This is a nasty one. It causes severe internal hemorrhaging and has a 100% mortality rate. Now, Galen noted that all of the victims who exhibited evidence of severe internal bleeding, none of them survived. The second strain was also nasty, but it had a 30% mortality rate, and this was the more dominant strain in this epidemic. It's what we call variola major. Here's what Galen is telling us about the symptoms of this disease. So fever, lesions in the nose, mouth, and throat, back pain, muscular pain, nausea and vomiting, dysentery, and in the always fatal cases, extreme internal bleeding was noted in the patient's digestive tract, and exanthem, and this is the telltale sign of the smallpox. It's an eruptive skin rash over most of the body that appeared in the form of blisters. These blisters eventually became black with blood, and if the patient survived, they would dry, turn into scabs, and fall off. The patient was contagious until the last scab fell off. So the period of being contagious was fairly long with this disease. Symptoms appear, according to Galen, about 9 to 12 days after exposure. People did survive this. About approximately 60% of people that contracted this strain of the virus survived it, but they would be left horribly scarred. Now, if you're sensitive to strong images, you may want to shut or avert your eyes for this next slide for the next 30 minutes. But I wanted you to, seconds. I won't do that to you, I promise. 30 seconds, maybe 35. But I wanted to show you what we're dealing with. These images here are smallpox victims in the United States in the early 20th century. And you can see I deliberately chose the black and white images because they're not as strong. The colored ones are stronger, and they're widely available on Google if you're interested. The last recorded smallpox case in the United States was 1949. The last case in the world was recorded in 1977. So all of these images come from around the 1920s. They stopped vaccinating for the smallpox in the 70s. I don't have a smallpox vaccination, but it's been declared an eradicated disease. So this is what these people, this is a pretty obvious image. So this is one of the reasons why we're fairly confident that we're retro-diagnosing this correctly. Archaeologically, we have these objects to back that up. If you have your eyes closed, you can open them now. These are better. These are what we call votives. Okay? These are objects that people had made or commissioned or made themselves, and they were presented to the shrines of either Apollo or Asclepius. These were gifts on the part of people who were ill or family members of people who were ill. They were gifts to these deities in a hope for a quid pro quo. I will present you with this gift. This is my plea for healing. And in return, they were hoping for a successful and happy resolution to this disease. So often we have a tremendous amount of information and understanding about how the Romans saw disease and injury based on these votive objects, because these votive objects, when they were presented at the temples, they were considered sacred. When they would pile up, they couldn't just be destroyed. They were ritually buried. So as archaeologists, we love to find these basically votive dumps outside of the temples. But you can see from the images that you just saw before, you've got the blisters, the afflicted person. Here's somebody's elbow. So we know that people were interacting with the gods, specifically regarding this disease at this time. Now, as the epidemic starts moving through the empire, it's hitting the military the hardest. And it started with the legions returning from the Parthian campaign. And like most epidemics, the rate at which it spreads depends not only on its communicability, but on the mobility of the population. Roman soldiers are one of the most mobile segments of Roman society, and there are a lot of them. The conditions they were living in was also a major factor in the spread of this disease. They were living in camps very close together, often in very cold or very hot climates. Their immune systems were already compromised by the conditions in which they were living. Troop movement and dense, difficult living conditions and compromised immune systems was a major factor, just as an example, in the spread of the Spanish flu in World War I. This was an epidemic that became a pandemic because of troop movement during the war. By the end of the 260s, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus both are with their troops on the Germanic front, north of the Adriatic, when plague broke out among their legions there. Now, Galen, when he was in Rome in 166, made his notes, made his observations, and got back to Pergamon as fast as he could. He did not want to stick around in Rome during this outbreak. But in 167, the epidemic had become so bad that he was recalled by the emperor. So he was with Marcus Aurelius when this was breaking out through the legions in 167. So this is Galen's second opportunity to make his notes and observations. Lucius Verus, Marcus Aurelius' co-emperor, died of this disease, died of the smallpox in 169. A lot of people don't know Marcus Aurelius had a co-emperor, and this is why. He wasn't on the scene for very long. And many people think that this is also the cause of Marcus Aurelius' death in 180. This particular phase of the outbreak lasts about 15 years as it's circulating through the empire. So besides the possible or probable deaths of these two emperors, the sort of conclude all of this by talking a little bit about what we know about the impact of this epidemic on the Roman society. So what we know and how we know it. Most of what we know comes to us from the Romans themselves, their own words, ancient documents. one of the most useful archaeological discoveries, not only pertaining to the Antonine Plague, but a whole host of other topics and historical events, was the discovery of thousands of papyri documents called the Oxyrhynchus papyri. These were discovered in the late 19th, early 20th century in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt. This is a site about 160 kilometers southwest of Cairo in Upper Egypt, and it's essentially an ancient rubbish dump. It contained documents in primarily Greek and Latin dating from the 1st century AD up to the 6th century AD. Here's some images of the excavation. Late 19th, early 20th. And this is not one of the documents that I'm interested in. They have not been digitized yet, although they are, the ultimate goal of this is to get all of the Oxyrhynchus papyri digitized and up online. But this is kind of a fun one. This is a fragment from Euclid's Elements that I put it up here because I wanted you to be able to visualize what these documents were. But for our purposes and what we're looking at, the ones that are the most helpful are the tax documents from various ancient cities in the region from the time right before and right after the plague. And what we see are local magistrates not so much concerned about the health of their population as they are about the significant drop in their tax base, which equates to a significant drop in state revenue. So, for example, these documents tell us that the population of a small town called Karanas in Egypt dropped by approximately 40% between 164 and 167. And similar records for an ancient town called Nessos tell us that 1/3 of the tax-paying population disappeared within a 2-month time period. Now, note that at this time, the tax-paying population was comprised of adult males, but we can attribute the same general decrease to the women and the children as well. But we have to be careful in attributing the entire loss of population just to disease. The primary strain of smallpox that we think we're dealing with has a mortality rate of 30%. In order to lose 30% of your population, that means every single person has to catch it. And that's not realistic. But the secondary consequence of an epidemic like this, which becomes a primary and just as important consequence, is fear. People fleeing, people leaving their jobs, leaving their property, leaving their neighbors and community, and running away. And so we're losing that. There's destabilization at the local level because people are leaving. So the cause is slightly different, but the effect is the same. Now, the land lease documents, also from Egypt, tell us that after the year 165, parcels of land being rented and farmed decreased significantly, and labor costs doubled. This follows a similar pattern that we have a better documentation for, and this is the Black Death of the 14th century. That was the bubonic plague, but this is well documented. There was such a huge loss in population, in labor supply, that people could command much more pay for the same work, and it changes the social structure of medieval Europe. Now, we have a series of military discharge documents called diplomata from the Balkan regions of the empire at this time, and they demonstrate that after 167, no one is permitted to be discharged from the army. The discharges simply stop, and they don't pick up again until 10 years later. So what's happening is no one's allowed to leave the army because they don't have enough soldiers. And Marcus Aurelius is forced to rebuild his decimated armies by conscripting slaves and gladiators and criminals. Offensive campaigns come to a halt. There are simply not enough soldiers to wage offensive campaigns. And records from Marcus Aurelius' administration tell us that the emperor is also obliged to rebuild his ranks by recruiting from the sons of soldiers, so boys that would normally be considered too young to join the army. Once Lucius Verus dies in 169, the burden of managing the crisis falls on Marcus Aurelius. Now, Roman law was already very strict with regard to where burials could take place. Marcus Aurelius made them even stricter so that the dead were not interred too close to the living. And in his own writings, Marcus Aurelius is telling us that thousands of people died in the city of Rome alone, including many members of the elite class. Viruses do not discriminate based on socioeconomic status. The same thing is happening in Athens. The same thing is happening in London. The same thing is happening in Upper Egypt. This is empire-wide. Now, Marcus Aurelius had to issue an edict that widened the eligibility requirements for membership to the Areopagus, which is the ruling body of Athens. Athens has lost so many people that there are not enough nobles, not enough aristocrats to fill the positions in government. Archaeological evidence, like inscriptions, particularly in the city of Rome proper, indicate that all major building projects for which Rome was famous. I mean, Romans were building like gangbusters during this time. I mean, this is what we think of when we think of ancient Rome, all these beautiful buildings. They came to a halt in 166, and we don't see any more major construction until 180, with the exception of religious shrines and temples. Now, the outbreaks of this epidemic in the Roman Empire occurred all the way until the end of the 2nd century. It sort of tapers off in 180, and then we see a resurgence of it again in 189. I believe that the plague of the 2nd century and the destabilization it caused was a major factor in the crisis in the following century. That is a century when there were over 50 emperors in 100 years. And the next phase of my research is going to be focused on how the plague changed the religious landscape of the Roman Empire. And we know that during Marcus Aurelius's rule, that he himself, even though he was not a religious man, he was very clear about this, he used state funds to revitalize worship of the gods. So he had this sense that this is what the surviving population needed. You see the rebuilding and repairing of shrines. He mandated that statues of Apollo be placed around major city walls in Asia Minor. Remember, Apollo is very closely connected to the plague. There was a recent study, an archaeological study done in London, showing that while there is a significant decrease in public building, there is a substantial increase in constructing shrines and temples and processional ways, processional streets. Now, I also believe that the Antonine Plague is one of the primary reasons we see a consolidation and an intensification in the practice of Christianity in the Roman Empire toward the end of the 2nd century. Now, Christianity has a theology that's very adapted to apocalyptic scenarios and far more clear and pleasant concept of the afterlife than the polytheistic Greco-Roman religions. So during and following the plague in general, we see an intensification of religious practices in many religions, Greco-Roman polytheism, Mithraism in the East, and Christianity just about everywhere. This is a very human response, and it's not at all unique to the Romans. And the crises in general are catalysts for an increase in religious practice and worship in just about any society. Even today, if you think about it, you would be hard-pressed to find a chapel in an office building, but there's one in almost every hospital. So turning toward the concept of a higher power is a very common reaction to events like this. And my work going forward is going to be looking at how the plague affected the religious practices of the Roman and the development of Christianity in particular. This is a century when Christianity is really coalescing and defining a more concrete theology. And I think this matters to us today because Judeo-Christianity very much underscores the fabric of our modern society here in the West. So that's going to occupy the next year of my life. So stay tuned. But thank you so much.